Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a ProRevenge story. In 2003, my parents had saved up enough money to build a modest ranch house in the suburbs. The local credit union approved the mortgage and signed a contract to provide Mike with the funds to construct the house. As it turned out, Mike was spreading himself too thin, taking on projects all over town and leaving his clueless workers to do the actual building. The construction dragged on longer and longer, with more and more work having to be torn out and redone. We're not talking about minor issues like using the wrong paint color or installing crooked trim. The architect had forgotten to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall right through the middle of the master bathroom shower. My mom was warned, don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets, because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of facing the driveway, and that was just the beginning. When the credit union's inspector showed up for the final walkthrough, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Mike's work. The inspector got annoyed since the credit union had already paid Mike a substantial amount. He marched to the front door and yanked on the doorknob, only to have the entire door, frame and all, fall on top of him. It had simply been wedged into place, not properly secured. The credit union called Mike, who finally showed up to oversee the work himself. The problem was, Mike wasn't any better at building a house than his workers were. My parents still refused to approve the house. My mom was a stay-at-home parent stuck in a rundown rental with 2 young kids while my dad was working 2 jobs during this whole ordeal. Throughout the entire process, the credit union and Mike treated them horribly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. I can't believe this is happening, my mom said one night, tears in her eyes. We've worked so hard for this house and now it's all falling apart. My dad tried to comfort her, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We'll figure something out, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Finally, the credit union threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Mike threatened to sue them for breach of contract because the credit union refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and explained the whole sorry situation. Plumbing issues, electrical problems, tiling disasters, the works. My parents were terrified. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this turned into a lengthy court battle, the credit union and Mike would win by default. The attorney, Sarah, was sympathetic, but my dad said he could tell from her facial expressions as she sorted through the paperwork that he and Mom were doomed. Then suddenly Sarah smiled. Let's get everyone together for a meeting, she told my parents. Tomorrow. The next day, my parents, Sarah, the credit union's representative, their attorney Mike, and Mike's attorney all gathered at the credit union. Sarah didn't give anyone else a chance to start. She said, well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it. Everyone else burst out laughing. Remove it? Have you lost your mind? Mike's attorney scoffed. Sarah, with a dramatic flourish, placed a deed on the table. My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's property. Mike's attorney stared at the deed, then turned to Mike. You built a house on land you don't own? Mike nodded sheepishly. The credit union's attorney started yelling at their representative. You didn't finance the land the house is on? The representative stammered. No, Sarah said firmly. As I stated, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state, immediately. My dad says he'll never forget the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table exchanged. Sure, the credit union could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week with no way to recover the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Mike was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the credit union would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents going forward. They might lose their down payment. But signing off on the house in its current condition would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace and repair everything from the roof to the foundation before the house could be safely inhabited. The credit union knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were treated like valued customers. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding, the credit union representative said nervously. We want to make this right. Mike chimed in. Absolutely. We'll fix everything to your satisfaction, no extra cost. The house was brought up to code and in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no additional cost to my parents. but at considerable expense to Mike. My parents signed the mortgage, Mike got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The credit union's representative was fired, and Sarah, attorney extraordinaire, got a fantastic tale of triumph to share with fellow lawyers for years to come. Before you question this story, please remember that 2003 was 20 years ago. Credit unions operated differently back then. Smaller suburban financial institutions in particular weren't run the same way as the bigger city banks were. There were fewer regulations, and in a smaller community, people didn't always follow them anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Yes, they built a wall through the shower. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunchbox on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the box, so he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Mike found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. The next one is an entitled people's story. Let me tell you about the absolute nightmare I've been dealing with for the past few months. It all started when my next-door neighbor, let's call him Brad, decided he wanted to build a pool in his backyard. Now, I've got nothing against pools, but what happened next had me seeing red. I've lived in my house for about 10 years now. It's a nice place with a decent-sized yard, and I've always taken pride in the row of beautiful oak trees that line the back of my property. These trees have been there for decades, providing shade and privacy, not to mention being home to a bunch of local wildlife. One day I came home from work to find a construction crew in Brad's yard. No big deal, I thought. He'd mentioned wanting to do some landscaping. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't just digging in his yard, they were on my property too. And not just a little bit over the line, they were a good 15 feet into my yard. I rushed over, waving my arms like a madman. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I yelled. The crew looked confused and called Brad over. He sauntered up with this smug look on his face. "Oh, hey neighbor, don't worry, we're just clearing some space for my new pool. It's gonna be great." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Brad, this is my property. You can't just come in here and start digging." He laughed it off. "Come on, man, it's just a few trees. They were blocking my view anyway. Plus, once the pool's in, you can use it too. It'll be great for the whole neighborhood." I was fuming. Not only had he trespassed and started destroying my property, but he was acting like he was doing me a favor. I told him to get his crew off my land immediately or I'd call the cops. Brad's attitude changed real quick. He started getting all defensive, saying the property line wasn't clear, and he thought this was all his land. I knew that was bull because we'd had a survey done when I first moved in, and the property line was clearly marked. I went inside and grabbed my property documents, then came back out to show Brad. He took one look at them and his face went pale. Suddenly he was all apologies and promises to fix everything. But the damage was already done. 4 of my beautiful oak trees had been cut down and hauled away. The ground was torn up where they'd started digging for the pool. It looked like a war zone. I was beyond pissed. These weren't just any trees. They were old growth oaks that had been there for generations. You can't just replace something like that overnight, not to mention the wildlife that had been disrupted. I told Brad he had 24 hours to get everything off my property and start making this right, or I'd be talking to my lawyer. He promised he would, practically falling over himself, apologizing. The next day, the construction crew was gone and Brad came over with a proposal. He offered to pay for new trees to be planted and to fix up the yard. I almost laughed in his face. Did he really think a few saplings could replace 50-year-old oaks? That's when I decided it was time to take real action. I called up my buddy who's a lawyer and explained the situation. He was shocked and told me I had a solid case for a lawsuit. We filed suit against Brad for trespassing, property damage, and the illegal removal of the trees. Turns out in our state there are specific laws about removing trees from someone else's property without permission. The fines can be hefty, especially for older trees like mine. Brad tried to settle out of court, offering me a pretty substantial sum. But I wasn't interested in just taking his money. I wanted justice, and I wanted to make sure he never pulled something like this again. The case went to court, and let me tell you, it was satisfying to watch Brad squirm as the judge tore into him. The judge was particularly upset about the environmental impact of removing established trees. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Brad was ordered to pay for the removal of the partially dug pool, complete restoration of my yard, including soil remediation, and the planting of new trees. But here's the kicker. He also had to pay me the estimated value of the trees he cut down. And let me tell you, mature oak trees are worth a lot more than you might think. All in all, Brad ended up having to pay over $150,000 in damages and fines. His precious pool project, completely scrapped. and you bet I made sure the new trees were planted in exactly the same spots as the old ones. But the story doesn't end there. Remember how Brad said the pool would be great for the whole neighborhood? Well, I decided to take him up on that idea, just not in the way he intended. With the money from the lawsuit, I decided to build my own pool, a really nice one, with a beautiful patio area and a state-of-the-art filtration system. And you know what? I invited the whole neighborhood to use it, everyone except Brad, that is. Now every summer I host awesome pool parties for all our neighbors. Kids splashing around, adults relaxing with cold drinks, the works. And poor Brad, he gets to watch from his sad, treeless yard, probably kicking himself forever thinking he could get away with bulldozing my property. The best part? Those new trees are growing fast. In a few years, they'll be tall enough to completely block Brad's view of my awesome pool. Karma's a funny thing, isn't it? So that's my story of how my neighbor's attempt to steal my land for his pool backfired spectacularly. I got justice, a brand new pool, and the satisfaction of knowing that Brad learned a very expensive lesson about respecting property lines. The moral of the story? Don't mess with your neighbor's trees. You never know when they might just turn into a pool that you're not invited to use. The next one is a petty revenge story. My ex-best friend was a full-blown grandiose narcissist. I'm talking about someone who refers to herself unironically as an alpha. She's a dive instructor, and she was given the nickname Hitler in her dive school, and she was proud of that. She's very charismatic and has created a small cult around her on the island she works on. These people are anyway cut off from the rest of the world, and every year when I visit the island I've seen them getting more and more in her service, and the ones who don't fall in line become social pariahs. It's a small island with few permanent residents, and no one wants to be socially isolated, so they toe her line. Well, today an old dean of mine reached out to me. She knows I'm an active diver, and she wanted some advice on who to dive with on this island as she's planning a trip. Now, for over the last decade, I have been steadily channeling work Alpha's way. I did the math, and thanks to me, over the years, 14 people have dived with her, my friends and family, and at least 6 of those have been repeat customers. Diving is an expensive hobby, and she's made a pretty package through me. She also gets commissions on accommodation, etc. when people book through her. Despite all this, she has behaved very unprofessionally with me on my last several trips, doing things like screaming at me in the dive shop or on the boat in front of other people, and one time even kicking me off the boat for someone else because she double booked. Totally unprovoked and totally unprofessional. It's almost like she was testing how far she could push me. Well, she pushed me too far. I snapped and ended the relationship. So I sent my dean a detailed email about the best dive schools, where to stay, where to eat, how to get around, etc. I ranked Alpha's dive school 3rd in my list, a ranking TripAdvisor agrees with, and I left a small note at the bottom. If you do dive there, steer clear of this instructor. It's not much, but I feels good. After 10 plus years of championing someone and getting treated like crap in return, it felt like a victory. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This story is a short one concerning my mom. Quick info for the setup. The house she lives in now was formerly rented by my grandmother, who died around the time my parents got divorced a couple of years ago. My parents had built the house in 1990, around the same time as an older woman did on the neighboring property. Let's call that woman Rita. When I was a toddler, we lived in the same house as my grandmother, but then we moved. I still remember that something was always a bit odd about Rita. She was particular. Her house smelled stale, like old shoes stored in a wet basement, and she had been a teacher before retirement, a strict one judging by her personality. Her whole property is fenced in, and at the front gate there is no bell. As far as I know, if you wanted something from her, you'd have to yell and hope she was home, or climb the fence. This is something I haven't figured out in 28 years. Rita always had her own opinions and was strange when it came to cars from visitors or even vehicles from the plumber or handyman parked in the tiny cul-de-sac our houses were located around. When my sister and I got old enough to drive and we'd park at the side of said cul-de-sac or there was a birthday gathering, you could bet all your money that Rita would get her car out of her garage on her property and park it outside her fence as well. Everyone would have to squeeze their car around hers. She does this to this day, just to make a point, I guess. When my grandmother died and my mom renovated the whole house to avoid reminders of her, our father had been pressuring her to get out of the old family house and move into the one our grandma died in barely 8 weeks before, Rita would give her unwelcome 2 cents about how it was different from how it had been for nearly 30 years. She would ask what my mom planned to do with the flowers and plants my grandma had loved and tended to all those years when my mom remodeled the garden, and if she thought my grandmother would like the changes since the house and garden no longer resembled their former appearance. You know, comments you just don't want to hear during such a difficult time. To cut this story short, Rita did many more things in her own form of demonstration of disapproval, or she would phrase criticism like a well-meant comment. So the day comes when my mom orders big metal plates, around 1 by 2 meters, with long stilts to hold them upright just on her side of the fence to Rita's garden. The fence is low and doesn't block the view. This sort of metal is supposed to oxidize as garden decoration and has a second purpose of creating a divider while the hedge was still growing. Here in Germany, there are many regulations for everything, some more sensible and logical than others. One of them is that for such metal dividers to be installed, you need your neighbor's approval when they are 200 meters high or higher and located between your properties. My mom had no intention of asking Rita because she would say no. Not that Rita asked when she planted her stuff right at the fence and it grew into my mom's flower beds. So a family friend dug up the holes, filled them with concrete, and erected the metal dividers at exactly 1.99 meters high. This way, my mom was complying with the laws and could easily deny any accusation if Rita took issue with the new additions. They were under the 2-meter mark after all. When I came over for a visit after their installation, my mom proudly showed them to me and told me why the exact height was so particular. We raised our wine glasses to this brilliant idea, and each time I see the metal dividers, I am reminded of how mischievous my mom can be when she wants to be, and how Rita has to look at oxidized metal plates from her side of the fence. The next one is an entitled people story. I, 20F at the time, and my wife, 21F at the time, are the first people in our group of friends to move out on our own. We have a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment, and we use the second bedroom as an office for my wife's side business and hobbies. A friend, 21F, from high school that we haven't talked to since graduation, recently had gotten into contact with us to reconnect with my wife. They were friends. I was more of an acquaintance with her. They both had some similar personal experiences since high school that I won't get into, but it basically led to her friend being kicked out of her parents' house and was now living with her aunt. Wife invited her over to hang out, and when she was over, I noticed the apartment perpendicular to ours was vacant and being renovated, so I offhandedly joked, "Oh, wouldn't it be so cool if you moved into there? It would be like friends." The following conversation went something like this. Friend: "Oh, that would be cool. Is it available?" Me: "I mean, they're renovating it right now, but I'm not sure if someone is in line for it. You should call the office Monday and ask." Friend: "Oh, okay." Now, seems perfectly normal and logical, right? Apparently not. I would not be able to predict what this would lead to in the following month if I was freaking Dr. Strange. So, 2 days later, it's my wife's birthday. We go on a day trip to Frankenmuth. Friend calls wife up and asks if she could spend the weekend at our place, saying she got into an argument with her aunt. Wife and I say sure, but we won't be back until late because of our trip. She says that's fine. She proceeds to text my wife almost hourly asking if we were on our way back yet, and that she was just waiting under the bridge near our place. We ignore her after the third-ish text until we are on our way back. It's about 1 a.m. when we come home, and we're both so tired we basically told her to take the couch and she was free to use our Netflix and that we were going to sleep. The next morning, my wife has already left for work. I walk into the living room to feed the cats, and I see that the friend has almost moved into the apartment. I'm talking fairy lights on above the couch, baskets of her clothes lined up against the wall, the couch is covered in her anime body pillows, which I did not expect, let me tell you, and she's laying back chillin' playing a ukulele, so I'm confused to say the least. I kind of just wave at her because I'm still waking up and I'm not entirely sure I'm not hallucinating. So I go into the kitchen and my sink is filled with dirty dishes, the counter has opened jars of something, and it's basically a mess and 100% not how it was left last night. And I know for a fact it was not my wife who made the mess. I don't want to be rude without knowing the full story, and honestly I barely know this girl, so I feed the cats and go back to my room to text my wife a basically, "Hey, WTF is happening right now," text. I basically stay in my room the whole day to avoid her, and I wait for my wife to come home to handle whatever this is. To summarize the main parts of the next month, the story goes something like this. Friend went home from the original hangout and basically told her aunt we had an apartment lined up for her, so she was moving out. Aunt thought it was all so sudden that something wasn't right. Friend ignores her and basically asks if she can stay with us. Wife says yes, assuming she's staying for a few days. Friend then reveals that she plans to stay with us until the apartment across was open and ready for her. She has not applied or was approved for the apartment. We try to politely nudge her into applying into apartments around the area since we kinda don't know what to do with this information. She then sees a few days later a man moving into the apartment she apparently thought was hers and asks me what is going on. I proceed to tell her she didn't apply for the apartment, so I don't really know what she was expecting. I ask if she's applied to any apartments. She says no. I tell my wife to talk some sense into her friend. A few days later, I come home to, again, lounging with fairy lights and a ukulele on my couch. I ask if she's applied to apartments. She says no, and that she can't because she doesn't have income since she quit her job when moving. I ask if she's applied to any jobs. She says no. At this point, it's been about 2 weeks and she has made my apartment a mess. She would leave dirty dishes and trash on my coffee table and in my sink, would sing and make noise constantly, and was frankly just overstaying her welcome beyond making me feel like a maid all of a sudden. So I politely bully my wife into fixing this since she's her friend and invited her in the first place. Wife takes her apartment hunting and friend has something to complain about with each one. Ceilings are too low, windows aren't big enough, that kind of thing. By the end of the day, wife is frustrated and friend turns to her and says the sentence that is the final nail in the coffin. I think the universe is telling me I'm supposed to stay with you guys in your apartment. To which my wife responds, the universe will bend, and then proceeds to take her to a hotel and make her stay there. Wife moves her stuff out of our apartment and into her car while talking to her like, what do you want to do with your life? And the conversation basically leads to my wife convincing her to buy a van and renovate and live in that and travel. The next day, she asks if she can come back to our apartment. I tell my wife to tell her absolutely not and to stay at the hotel or go back to her aunt's. She ends up staying with her parents until she gets a van and then spends a month renovating it and then drives to LA while making music in her van. I don't know, we haven't talked to her since. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.